The fields stretch wide, but the bellies remain empty. In the medieval world, peasants labored from dawn to dusk, yet hunger and disease never left their doors. Their homes were mud and smoke, their days filled with toil, and their nights with fear. Survival was not a promise, it was a fragile gamble against death itself. If history's hidden truths haunt you, leave a like to keep the fire burning, and subscribe to Nighttime Historian, where the past is told in shadows. Tonight, we uncover the disturbing lives of medieval peasants, and why survival was nearly impossible. The bell towers like a bone in morning mist, its bronze tongue heavy with the weight of centuries. In the gray light that seeps through shuttered windows and beneath rotting thatch, 10,000 souls stir in hovels that might house swine in better ages. But these are not better ages. These are the years when God's hand presses down like stone upon stone, when the earth itself seems cursed, when to wake is to face another day of dying slowly. Listen. In the distance, the monastery bell tolls prime, calling the faithful to prayer. But faith is a luxury here, where survival carves deeper grooves than devotion, where the only sacrament is the bitter bread of endurance. The sound echoes across fields that stretch brown and barren beneath a sky the color of old pewter, fields that promise nothing but the harvest of despair. In the village of Grimwald, though it bears a name, it might be any of 10,000 such places scattered like scabs across the body of Christendom. A woman named Margot draws her knees to her chest on a bed of moldering straw. The walls around her weep with moisture that never dries, condensation born of too many bodies breathing too little air in too small a space. Her husband Aldrich lies beside her, his chest rising and falling with the labored rhythm of lungs that have known too much smoke, too much dust, too much of the thick air that settles in hovels where the chimney is a hole in the roof and the floor is earth beaten hard as stone by generations of desperate footsteps. Their children, 3 that lived past their first winter, 2 more whose names are carved only in their parents' hearts, sleep in a tangle of limbs and rags in the corner farthest from the door. The door itself is planks bound with leather, swollen with damp until it fits its frame like flesh pressed into a wound. Beyond it, the world waits with its 1,000 daily cruelties, its endless catalogue of ways to break the human spirit. But first, there is hunger. Margot's stomach contracts with a pain sharp as winter iron. It has been 3 days since they finished the last of the barley porridge, thin as water and gritty with chaff and the small stones that somehow always find their way into the grain. 3 days of chewing strips of leather boiled until they surrender what little nourishment they might hold, of gnawing turnip tops and the inner bark of trees, of watching her youngest daughter's eyes grow large in a face that seems to grow smaller each day. The hunger is not new. It is the constant companion, the unwelcome guest that never leaves the table, the weight that sits in the belly like a stone. In good years, it merely gnaws. In bad years, and there have been too many bad years in succession now, it devours from within, hollowing out the body until flesh clings to bone like wet cloth to a stick. Aldrich stirs beside her, and she hears in his breathing the rattle that has grown worse through the long nights of this endless winter. The sound of lungs that have breathed too much wood smoke, too much dust from threshing floors, too much of the fetid air that gathers in spaces where too many people live too close together. The sound of a body slowly drowning in its own decay. "The Lord's steward comes today," he whispers, his voice raw as rope pulled through sand. The words hang in the air between them like smoke, carrying with them the weight of all the fears that cluster in the darkness before dawn. Tax day. Rent day. The day when what little they have managed to scrape together through another season of backbreaking labor will be measured and weighed and taken away, leaving them to face another year with even less than they began with. Outside, a rooster crows with the harsh authority of those who have never known hunger, never felt the cold seep into their bones through walls thin as prayers. But its call is answered not by the cheerful bustle of morning, but by the low moans of those who face another day of impossible choices. Another 16 hours of trying to pull sustenance from soil that grows more barren each year. Another sunset that brings them no closer to anything that might be called hope. The taxation that awaits them is not mere coins counted into a purse. It is the tithe of flesh itself, a third of their meager grain harvest, a portion of eggs from chickens already too thin to lay regularly, days of labor given free to the Lord's domain, while their own small strips of land lie fallow and calling. It is the mathematics of survival, and the numbers never add up in their favor. Margot rises from the straw, her joints protesting with the sharp ache that has become her morning companion. At 32 summers, her body moves like that of a woman twice her age, bent and worn by labor that begins before dawn and ends long after darkness falls. Her hands, once soft enough to catch a lover's attention, are now maps of calluses and scars, testimony to years of wielding sickle and flail, of scrubbing and hauling and mending and making do with less than enough. She moves to the single window, no more than a hole in the wall covered with oiled cloth so thin the light filters through it like weak wine. Through this membrane between inside and out, she can see the village stirring to reluctant life. Smoke begins to rise from chimneys, gray threads stitched into the gray sky. Doors creak open to discharge figures wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they can layer against the cold. The daily procession of survival begins again. But there is something else in the morning air, something that makes her breath catch in her throat like a sharp stone swallowed. The quality of light is wrong, filtered through a haze that speaks not of morning mist but of smoke on the horizon. To the east, where the road winds through the forest toward the market town of Millhaven, the sky bears a stain like old blood. War. The word forms in her mind unbidden, carrying with it the full catalogue of horrors that have become as common as sunrise in these lands. Not the glorious war sung by troubadours in the halls of nobles, but war as the peasant knows it, the war of burned fields and slaughtered livestock, of soldiers who take what they will and kill what they cannot carry, of refugees streaming along roads with their children clutched to their chests and their possessions balanced on their backs. She has seen it before. The summer when she was 15, when the Lord's men came riding hard from the south with news of raiders burning their way through the borderlands. The village had 3 days to prepare, 3 days to hide what little they could not afford to lose, to drive the remaining livestock deep into the forest, to bury their seed grain in pits covered with brush and marked only in their memory. It had not been enough. It is never enough. The soldiers had come like locusts, stripping the land bare not out of malice but out of the simple mathematics of armies on the move. Horses must eat. Men must eat. And what is the grain of peasants compared to the needs of those who carry swords and wear the colors of distant lords whose quarrels are settled with the blood and hunger of those who never chose sides? Now, looking at that stain on the eastern sky, Margot feels the familiar weight of dread settle upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from all the fears she has learned to carry. The steward's visit will be the least of their troubles if war comes again to these lands. Tax collectors can be reasoned with, sometimes. They understand the mathematics of exploitation, that the goose must be kept alive to lay more golden eggs. But soldiers are different. Soldiers take everything because they know they may not pass this way again. Behind her, the children begin to stir with the restless movements of those who sleep hungry and wake with their stomachs already gnawing at their spines. Little Bess, the youngest at 7 summers, makes the small mewling sounds that have replaced the lusty cries of infancy. At 7, she should be helping with the lighter work, learning the skills that will keep her alive through the years ahead. Instead, she grows thinner with each passing day, her small body consuming itself in its desperate search for the nutrition it cannot find. This is the arithmetic of medieval survival, where every calorie is a victory wrested from a world that offers nothing freely. A grown man requires perhaps 2,500 of these invisible units of energy each day to maintain his strength for the backbreaking labor that is his only currency. But the diet of dark bread, thin porridge, and occasional scraps of cheese or eggs provides perhaps 1,500 on a good day, 1,000 on a bad one, and sometimes, in the depths of winter or the hungry months before harvest, far less than that. The body, that miraculous machine of bone and muscle and will, begins to consume itself. Fat reserves disappear first, then muscle mass, then the invisible components that fight disease and maintain the complex chemistry of life. This is why the plague finds such fertile ground among the poor, why a simple cold becomes pneumonia, why wounds that should heal fester and spread their poison through blood already weakened by chronic deprivation. Young Tam, her middle son at 10 summers, rolls away from his sisters with the automatic movements of those who have learned to guard even their share of sleeping space. His face in the gray morning light shows the sharp planes that have replaced the soft roundness of childhood. His eyes, when they open, hold the watchful wariness of those who have learned that the world is a place of endless competition for resources too scarce to share freely. This is what hunger does to children. It steals not just their flesh but their childhood itself, replacing the natural joy and curiosity of youth with the grim calculations of survival. At 10, Tam can judge the ripeness of grain by sight and touch, can calculate how many days a given portion of bread might last, can read the signs of approaching weather in the behavior of birds and the color of clouds. These are skills that should come with age and experience, but necessity has made him old before his time. The baby stirs against Margot's breast, seeking the nourishment that has grown more meager with each passing day. Her milk, once rich and abundant, now comes thin and sparse, her body unable to produce what it does not possess. She has felt the baby's grip grow weaker, felt the small body grow lighter in her arms despite the passing months that should bring growth and strength. This is the cruel mathematics of medieval motherhood, where bringing life into the world is often tantamount to condemning it to a slow death by degrees. Of every 10 children born in villages like Grimwald, perhaps 4 will see their 5th birthday. Of those, perhaps 2 will survive to bear children of their own. These are not numbers written in any ledger, not statistics compiled by scholars safe in their scriptoriums. These are the children who slip away in the night, who succumb to fevers that would be minor inconveniences in better-fed bodies, who simply fail to thrive in a world that offers them no encouragement to do so. Aldrich sits up with a grunt that speaks of joints stiff with cold and labor. His back, bent daily over furrow and harvest, protests the simple act of rising. He is 35 summers old, ancient by the standards of his class and time, his body worn down by decades of work that would break a draft horse. His hands, like his wife's, are landscapes of scars and calluses, each one a story of desperate labor under impossible conditions. "The seed grain," he says, and the words carry the weight of all their hopes for the year to come. Hidden beneath loose stones in the corner of their hovel lies their most precious possession, 2 small sacks of barley and rye, saved from last year's harvest despite the gnawing hunger that made every kernel a temptation. This is the grain they will plant when the earth softens, the foundation of next year's survival. Without it, they face not just hunger but actual starvation. But the steward's visit brings with it the threat that even this might be taken. In years when the harvest has been particularly poor, when the Lord's own stores run low, the seed grain of peasants becomes fair game for taxation. It is a short-sighted policy that condemns the land to fallow fields and ensures that next year's harvest will be even more meager. But desperation makes poor decisions of all men, noble and common alike. The smoke on the horizon grows thicker as they watch, no longer a distant stain, but a visible column rising into the morning sky. Millhaven burns, or something near it. The market town where they might trade eggs for needles, where the monthly fair brings merchants from distant places with salt and iron and news of the wider world. If Millhaven falls, their isolation becomes complete, their tiny village cut off from even the minimal contact with the outside world that makes their existence barely tolerable. This is how war comes to places like Grimwald, not as a glorious charge of knights in shining mail, but as smoke on the horizon, as refugees streaming along muddy roads, as the slow realization that the thin threads connecting them to civilization are being cut one by one. The knights and lords who play their games of dynasty and conquest are insulated from these realities by their wealth and power. It is the peasants who pay the true cost of noble ambition, who watch their fields burn to fuel wars they did not start and cannot understand. The baby's cries grow more insistent, a thin wailing that seems to pierce the gray morning air like needles. Margot holds the small body closer to her breast, feeling through the worn cloth the fragile architecture of ribs and spine, the soft spot on the skull that should be firm and strong by now but remains yielding as ripe fruit. This child, born in the harvest season when hope traditionally runs highest, has known nothing but the long slide into winter scarcity, nothing but the gradual dimming of the world's promises. Around them, the village completes its reluctant awakening. Doors creak open to release figures bent double under bundles of firewood, precious fuel gathered stick by stick from forests that grow more distant each year as the nearby groves are stripped bare. Children emerge, their faces pinched with cold and hunger, to begin the daily search for anything that might be eaten: acorns to be ground into meal, roots to be boiled into thin soup, scraps of bark that can be made edible through patient preparation. This foraging is not the romantic communion with nature that poets might imagine, but a desperate scramble for survival in which every plant, every fallen nut, every scrap of organic matter becomes a potential source of the calories needed to make it through another day. Children learn to distinguish between the mushrooms that might nourish and those that will kill, to find the thin line between bark that can be digested and bark that will tear the stomach apart, to extract nutrition from sources that would revolt those who have never known true hunger. The sound of hoofbeats on the muddy track that serves as the village's main road cuts through the morning air like a blade through cloth. Too early for the steward, too heavy for a simple messenger. These are the sounds of armed men, of horses trained for war, of trouble approaching at the gallop. Margot feels her blood turn to ice water in her veins, feels the familiar paralysis of those who have learned that they are powerless in the face of forces greater than themselves. The smoke on the horizon, the sound of approaching hooves, the thin cries of her hungry baby, all of it combines into a moment of perfect clarity about their situation. They are trapped, small creatures caught in the open when the wolves come hunting. Aldrich moves to the door with the automatic responses of one who has faced such moments before. His hand finds the handle of the wood axe, the only weapon their poverty allows them. Not much protection against trained soldiers, but enough perhaps to make their deaths more expensive than their lives were worth. Sometimes, in the cruel mathematics of survival, that is the best calculation available. The hoofbeats grow closer, accompanied now by the jingle of harness and the creak of leather, the sounds of professional soldiers on the move. Through the oiled cloth window, Margot catches glimpses of movement, the flash of metal in the gray light, the dark bulk of horses whose well-fed bodies shame the scarecrow thinness of the village livestock. This is the moment when theory becomes reality, when the abstract knowledge that they live at the mercy of forces beyond their control becomes the immediate presence of those forces at their door. The soldiers who approach care nothing for the desperate calculations that govern peasant life, nothing for the careful hoarding of seed grain, or the thin line between survival and starvation. They see only resources to be taken, obstacles to be cleared, problems to be solved with the simple application of superior force. The baby's cries reach a pitch that seems to cut through flesh and bone, a sound that speaks of needs that will not be met, of hunger that will not be satisfied, of a small life guttering like a candle in the wind. Margot rocks the tiny body against her breast, whispering the meaningless comfort words that mothers have always whispered to children facing a world that offers them no comfort. Outside, the first shouts begin, not the disciplined commands of professional soldiers but the raw cries of men whose blood runs hot with the excitement of violence about to begin. The sound of doors splintering, of chickens squawking as they are seized by rough hands, of neighbors calling out in voices thick with terror and desperate courage. The raid has begun. But this is not yet the moment of final confrontation, not yet the climax toward which all their fears have been building. This is still the gathering of forces, the tightening of the rope before it snaps. The true test lies ahead, in the choices they will be forced to make when there are no good choices left, when survival itself becomes an act of moral compromise that will haunt them through whatever days remain. In the gray light that filters through their pathetic window, with the sounds of violence growing closer and the smoke of distant fires staining the sky, Margot holds her dying child and waits for the world to end. Again. The door splinters inward with the sound of bones breaking, and with it comes the reek of horses and steel and men who have been too long on the road. 3 figures fill the doorway, their bodies made massive by leather and mail, their faces dark with the grime of travel and the anticipation of violence. Behind them, the morning sky glows with the orange light of flames, and the air carries the screams of neighbors whose doors have already fallen. Aldrich stands before his family with the wood axe raised, but the gesture is as futile as prayers whispered into a hurricane. These are not bandits desperate for scraps, but soldiers in service to powers that dwarf the comprehension of simple peasants. Their weapons are well maintained, their horses fed, their movements coordinated with the precision that comes only from professional training and absolute confidence in their superiority. The leader, A man whose scarred face speaks of battles survived and lessons learned in the hardest possible school, lets his gaze sweep the hovel with the calculating attention of one who has done this many times before. He sees everything in an instant: the pathetic poverty, the hungry children, the thin woman clutching her baby, the man with his tool raised in defiance. All of it catalogued and dismissed as irrelevant to his purposes. "Stand aside," he says, and his voice carries the flat authority of those accustomed to immediate obedience. The words are not cruel, not kind, merely functional. A command issued to obstacles that will comply or be removed. "We seek the Lord's grain." The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. Lord's grain, in a hovel where the inhabitants count kernels like precious stones, where children gnaw on leather scraps and call it supper. But the soldiers see only what their orders tell them to see: a village owing tribute, peasants who must surely be hiding stores they claim not to possess, resistance that must be broken to maintain the proper order of things. Margot feels her baby grow still against her breast, the small body seeming to sense that this is a moment when even the cry of hunger might be dangerous. Around her, her other children press close, their eyes wide with the particular terror of the young who understand that their world is ending but lack the experience to know what might come after. Young Tam, old beyond his years in so many ways, still possesses the dangerous courage of those who have not yet learned the true cost of heroism. He steps forward, placing himself between the soldiers and his mother, his small fists clenched in defiance that would be admirable if it were not so certain to end in tragedy. "We have nothing," Aldrich says, and the words carry the weight of absolute truth. "The harvest failed. The grain is gone. There is nothing here worth your taking." But soldiers see truth differently than peasants. To them, claims of poverty are merely the expected lies of those trying to avoid their obligations. The mathematics of their profession demands that they extract value from every village they visit, that they return to their commanders with proof of their efficiency and dedication. Empty hands mean failure, and failure in military service is measured in floggings and demotions, and the slow slide toward the anonymous death that awaits those who disappoint their betters. The scarred leader nods to his companions, and they move through the hovel with the systematic thoroughness of locusts. Straw is scattered, the few pathetic possessions examined and discarded, the corners probed for hiding places that might conceal imaginary wealth. They work in silence broken only by the sound of wood splitting and cloth tearing, the methodical destruction of lives already balanced on the knife's edge of catastrophe. When they find the hidden seed grain, the moment hangs in the air like the pause between lightning and thunder. The small sacks, buried beneath stones and desperate prayers, represent the difference between another year of desperate survival and the final slide into starvation. In the hands of the soldiers, they become merely another item to be loaded onto pack animals and carried away to feed distant armies. "Please," Margot whispers, and the word carries all the weight of motherhood confronting its own powerlessness. "That is for planting. Without it we cannot." The leader's backhand catches her across the mouth with casual efficiency, not born of anger but of the simple need to maintain discipline. Blood blooms on her lips, bright as poppies, and she staggers back against the wall with the baby clutched to her chest. The lesson is clear and immediate: resistance will be met with escalating force, and the mathematics of violence heavily favor those with training and equipment, and the backing of distant authority. Tam's cry of rage is cut short as one of the soldiers seizes him by the hair, lifting him until his feet barely touch the ground. The boy's struggles are useless against the man's strength, but he continues to fight with the desperate fury of those who have nothing left to lose. His small fists beat against armored arms that might as well be iron for all the effect they produce. "Brave lad," the leader says, and there might be genuine admiration in his voice. "But courage without wisdom is merely another form of stupidity." He gestures, and the soldier releases Tam to crash against the wall beside his mother. The boy slides down to sit among the scattered straw, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes still burning with unquenched defiance. At 10 years old, he has learned a lesson that will stay with him for however many years remain to him: that the world is ruled by force, and those without force must learn to endure what they cannot prevent. Outside, the systematic destruction continues. Chickens squawk and flutter as they are seized for the pot, their eggs gathered into baskets that will feed soldiers rather than the children who tended them. The village's single cow, pregnant and precious beyond measure, is led away with a rope around her neck, her lowing protests ignored by men who see only meat on legs. Gardens are trampled, fences torn down for firewood, wells fouled with the casual indifference of those who will not remain to drink from them. This is war as it truly exists, stripped of poetry and glory and reduced to its essential function, the transfer of resources from the weak to the strong, the imposition of will through the systematic application of violence. The great causes that motivate lords and kings become, at this level, simply the justification for taking what others have spent their lives accumulating. The baby in Margot's arms begins to cry again, thin wails that seem to pierce the air like accusations. The sound draws the attention of the scarred leader, who steps closer to examine the small bundle she holds so protectively. His face, weathered by years of campaigns in distant lands, shows something that might be pity or might simply be the practical assessment of a problem requiring solution. "The child is sick," he observes, and it is not a question. Even to his untrained eye, the signs are obvious. The gray pallor of skin, the sunken eyes, the listless movements that speak of a body slowly consuming itself in its search for sustenance it cannot find. "How long?" Margot cannot answer, cannot trust her voice to carry words that will not betray the depth of her desperation. But her silence speaks volumes to one who has seen such scenes played out in villages across the width and breadth of kingdoms locked in their eternal struggles for dominance. The baby is dying, slowly but inevitably, starved of the nutrition needed to sustain the complex miracle of human life. This is the reality that underlies all the grand strategies and noble causes, that war is ultimately waged on the bodies of children, that the cost of every campaign is measured not just in soldiers fallen but in civilians who starve while armies consume the resources that might have kept them alive. The baby cradled against its mother's breast represents countless others like it, small lives extinguished not by sword or fire but by the simple mathematics of scarcity imposed by military necessity. The leader reaches into his purse and withdraws something that glints in the gray light filtering through the ruined doorway. For a moment, hope flickers in Margot's eyes. Perhaps mercy exists even in the hearts of those whose profession is violence. Perhaps some human compassion survives beneath the armor and indifference. But what he produces is not coin but steel, a small knife with a blade honed to razor sharpness. He holds it balanced across his palm, its weight negligible but its meaning absolute. The message requires no words, no explanation. The child suffers and will continue to suffer. The tools to end that suffering are available. The choice rests with those who love the child enough to make it. The silence that follows is deeper than death, filled with the weight of decisions that no parent should ever face but which have become commonplace in these lands where survival itself is a luxury few can afford. Margot stares at the knife as if it were a serpent, understanding its purpose but unable to comprehend a world in which such purposes become necessary. Aldrich moves closer to his wife, his work-worn hands gentle as they touch her shoulders. His face has aged years in the space of minutes, the lines around his eyes deepening as he contemplates choices that exist only in the realm of nightmares. But this is not nightmare. This is the waking world of medieval peasantry, where love itself becomes a form of cruelty when it prolongs suffering without hope of relief. "The other children," he whispers, and the words contain equations that make sense only in the arithmetic of desperation. 3 living children, 1 dying. Resources sufficient perhaps to keep 3 alive through the remainder of winter, if those resources are not divided further. The mathematics are cruel but undeniable, visible in the thinning faces of his surviving offspring, audible in the weakness of their voices as they call for food that does not exist. Young Tam looks up from where he sits against the wall, his face still streaked with blood but his eyes showing the terrible comprehension of those forced to mature too quickly. He understands what is being offered, what is being contemplated. At 10 years old, he grasps the brutal calculus that governs their existence. That sometimes love requires actions that tear the soul apart, that survival demands sacrifices that make survival itself questionable. The baby's cries grow weaker, not from any consolation but from the simple exhaustion of a body that lacks the energy to sustain even the expression of its own distress. Its small fingers, once capable of gripping with surprising strength, now flutter like autumn leaves in a dying wind. The decline is visible from day to day now, no longer the gradual wasting they had tried to ignore, but the unmistakable approach of an ending they lacked the power to prevent. Outside, the destruction continues with the methodical efficiency of those who have done this work many times before. Houses are searched and stripped, valuables seized, anything that might feed or equip an army loaded onto wagons for transport to wherever the campaign leads next. The sound of weeping mingles with the clatter of hooves and the shouts of soldiers, creating a symphony of human misery that has played in countless villages across the face of medieval Europe. But inside the hovel, time seems suspended, crystallized around the moment of choice that hangs between them like a sword balanced on its point. The knife lies in the soldier's palm, either offered nor withdrawn, simply present as an option that acknowledges the reality of their situation. He has seen this scene before, will see it again before his own service ends in whatever manner soldiers' services end. He knows the weight of the choice they face because he has watched others face it, has seen strong men broken and loving mothers driven mad by decisions that should not exist in any world governed by mercy. Little Bess, the 7-year-old daughter whose own thinness speaks of months of inadequate nutrition, creeps closer to her mother on hands and knees. Her movement is careful, instinctive, the approach of a child who senses that sudden sounds or actions might shatter something that can never be repaired. She reaches out one small hand to touch her baby sibling's foot, and her fingers encounter skin cold as winter stone. The recognition in her eyes is immediate and complete. She has felt death before, has helped wrap the bodies of neighbors' children, has learned to distinguish between the sleep that brings rest and the sleep from which there is no waking. Her face, already gaunt with hunger, takes on the gray pallor that marks those who have looked directly into the abyss and seen their own reflections staring back. This is childhood in the medieval peasant world, not the protected innocence that later ages would consider natural, but the forced intimacy with mortality that comes from living always on the edge of the possible. Children learn early to recognize the signs of impending death, learn to calculate the odds of survival, learn to make peace with losses that would devastate adults in more sheltered circumstances. The baby's breathing becomes irregular, shallow gasps that seem to catch in its throat like prayers half-spoken. Its eyes, when they open, show the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes to those approaching death, not the awareness of consciousness but the transparency of flesh grown too thin to conceal the soul within. The small body seems to be consuming itself from within, the last reserves of energy being burned to fuel the basic functions that sustain life for a few more precious hours. Margot rocks her child with movements that have become automatic, driven by instincts deeper than thought. The motion serves no purpose now, cannot ease hunger that has progressed beyond the reach of comfort, cannot warm flesh that has lost the ability to retain heat. But the rocking continues because it is all she has left to offer, the last gift of a mother who has exhausted every other resource in her desperate attempt to preserve this small life entrusted to her care. The scarred soldier watches with the patience of one who has learned not to hurry such moments. He has seen death in many forms, the sudden violence of battle, the slow agony of infected wounds, the quiet departure of those who simply lack the strength to continue. But there is something particularly bitter about watching it claim children, about witnessing the failure of the most basic promise that civilization makes to its members, that the young will be protected, that innocence will be preserved, that love will be sufficient to ward off the darkest possibilities. Yet he also knows, with the hard-won wisdom of experience, that sometimes love requires actions that seem to contradict its very nature. Sometimes mercy wears the face of cruelty, and the greatest kindness lies in ending suffering rather than prolonging it. The knife in his palm represents not callousness but recognition, acknowledgement that the world offers choices too terrible to make but too necessary to avoid. Aldrich kneels beside his wife, his face wet with tears that fall like rain on barren ground. His hands, those instruments of endless labor, shake as they hover over his dying child. In those hands lies all the work that has kept his family alive through seasons of scarcity, all the desperate effort to wrest survival from a world that offers it grudgingly. But now those same hands must contemplate an action that violates everything he has ever believed about their purpose. God forgive us! he whispers, and the words are not addressed to the soldiers or to his wife or to his children. They are spoken to whatever presence might exist beyond the gray sky that presses down upon their hovel like a stone lid on a tomb. An appeal to divine understanding for choices that exist only in the realm of human desperation, for love that expresses itself through actions that love should never require. The baby draws one last breath, holds it for a moment that stretches toward eternity, then releases it in a sigh that seems to carry away something more than air. In that exhalation, the small spirit departs, leaving behind only the cooling shell that once housed hope and possibility, and all the dreams that parents weave around their children's futures. The silence that follows is absolute, deeper than the quiet of empty churches, more complete than the hush that falls over battlefields when the fighting ends. It is the silence of questions answered in ways that destroy the questioners, of problems solved by solutions that create greater problems, of mercy achieved through means that make mercy itself suspect. Margot clutches the still form to her breast, her body refusing to accept what her mind already knows. The rocking continues, automatic as breathing, pointless as prayer in a world that seems to have forgotten the meaning of salvation. Her tears fall on skin that will never again feel warmth, lips that will never again cry for the nourishment she could not provide. The soldier closes his hand around the knife and returns it to its sheath. The tool is no longer needed. Death has accomplished what mercy could not, has ended suffering through the simple expedient of ending life itself. He turns away from the scene, not from callousness but from respect for grief that requires no witness, pain that asks only to be left alone with its devastating completeness. Outside, the systematic looting of the village reaches its conclusion. The wagons are loaded, the horses fed and watered, the soldiers mounted and ready to continue their march toward whatever objective justifies this destruction. They leave behind them a community stripped not just of its material wealth but of its hope, families broken not just by loss of property, but by the moral compromises that survival has demanded. As the sound of hooves fades into the distance, Grimwald settles into a silence that speaks of ending rather than peace. The smoke from burning Millhaven continues to stain the eastern sky, a reminder that the destruction witnessed here is merely one note in a larger symphony of violence that plays across the medieval landscape like a storm that never ends. But in the hovel where a mother holds her dead child, time has stopped completely. The calculations that govern peasant survival no longer apply, the desperate mathematics of calorie and coin rendered irrelevant by a loss that exists beyond the reach of any equation. Love itself has become a wound that will never heal, a burden that will make every day forward a lesson in the impossible weight of memory. This is the true cost of medieval warfare, not the glory sung in halls or the honor won on distant fields, but the small bodies that grow cold in their mother's arms, the choices that destroy those who make them, the silence that follows when there are no words left for grief too deep to express. The dawn light grows stronger, but it illuminates only devastation. And in that gray illumination, 3 remaining children learn the final lesson their world has to teach, that love itself can become a luxury too expensive for the poor to afford. 7 days pass like stones dropped into deep water, each one disappearing into the dark void that has replaced what they once called life. The baby lies wrapped in the only clean cloth they possessed, a shroud torn from Margot's wedding dress, the white fabric now stained with the brown of earth and the salt of tears that seemed to flow without end. They have not buried the small body. The ground is frozen hard as iron, and Aldrich lacks the strength to break earth that has turned to stone beneath the weight of an endless winter. So the bundle lies in the corner where the living children once slept, a presence that fills the hovel with the weight of unspoken accusations and love that has nowhere left to flow. The seed grain is gone, carried away in the soldiers' wagons along with everything else that might have sustained them through the hungry months ahead. What remains is less than nothing. It is the negative space where hope once lived, the hollow echo of plans that will never come to fruition. Without seed, there can be no planting. Without planting, no harvest. Without harvest, only the slow slide toward an ending that grows more certain with each passing day. But hunger is patient. It does not kill quickly, does not grant the mercy of swift conclusion. Instead, it works methodically, systematically, taking the body apart piece by piece like a structure being demolished with careful attention to which supports can be removed before the whole edifice collapses. First to go are the reserves of fat that the body stores against lean times. But peasant bodies carry little such insurance. Their lives are too marginal, their intake too carefully balanced against their expenditure, to allow for the luxury of surplus. What little padding of flesh they possessed disappeared weeks ago, leaving them gaunt as scarecrows, their clothes hanging loose on frames that seem to shrink daily. Next comes the muscle mass, the hard-earned strength that is their only currency in a world that values nothing so much as the ability to labor. Aldrich feels it in the trembling of his hands as he tries to split kindling, in the weakness of his grip as he struggles to lift burdens that once seemed negligible. His body, desperate for fuel, begins to consume its own tissue, cannibalizing the very strength he needs to search for sustenance. The children show the signs most clearly. Young Tam, once quick and energetic despite the hardships of his short life, now moves with the careful deliberation of an old man. His face has taken on the sharp angles that mark advanced starvation, the skin stretched tight over bones that seem too large for the flesh that covers them. His eyes, always bright with intelligence, have grown huge in a skull that appears to be collapsing inward upon itself. Little Bess fares worse. At 7, her body lacks the reserves that allow adults to endure extended periods of deprivation. She spends most of her time curled in the straw, conserving energy that she no longer possesses, her breathing shallow and irregular. When she speaks, which is rarely now, her voice carries the hollow quality of sounds echoing in empty spaces. Their middle daughter, 9-year-old Marta, tries to maintain the pretense that they are still a family functioning within the bounds of normal existence. She tends the fire with sticks scavenged from the wreckage of neighbors' homes, boils water to fill their stomachs with liquid warmth, searches the corners of their hovel for crumbs and scraps that might have been overlooked. But her efforts have the desperate quality of someone trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands. This is hunger's particular cruelty, that it allows its victims to remain conscious throughout their own dissolution, to watch with clear eyes as their bodies betray them, as their minds grow clouded with the fog of malnutrition, as their capacity for hope diminishes in direct proportion to their physical deterioration. They remain aware enough to understand what is happening to them, but lack the power to prevent it. The village around them has entered its own death spiral. Of the 37 families that called Grimwald home before the soldiers came, perhaps 20 remain. The others have taken to the roads, joining the endless streams of refugees who flow like tributaries of human misery across the landscape of medieval Europe. They carry their possessions on their backs and their children in their arms, searching for some place where the mathematics of survival might work out in their favor. But there are no such places. The same forces that devastated Grimwald have touched every village, every town, every settlement throughout the region. War moves like plague, leaving in its wake communities stripped of resources and hope, populations scattered to the winds in search of sustenance that grows more scarce with each passing season. Those who remain in Grimwald do so not from choice but from the simple inability to imagine alternatives. They are too weak to travel, too attached to the familiar patterns of their lives to embrace the uncertainty of the road. They cling to their hovels as drowning men cling to debris, not because it offers salvation but because it is all they have left to hold. The social bonds that once held the community together begin to fray under the pressure of scarcity. Neighbors who once shared freely now guard their meager possessions with suspicious eyes. Children are kept close to home, not from fear of strangers but from the knowledge that desperation can transform even friends into predators. Willem the miller, whose family has operated the village's grain mill for 6 generations, now presides over machinery that sits idle for want of anything to grind. His millstones, worn smooth by centuries of use, gather dust while he and his kin slowly starve in sight of the tools that once provided their livelihood. The irony is sharp enough to cut. A miller dying of hunger, his expertise rendered worthless by the absence of grain. Old Greta, the village's herbalist and midwife, finds her knowledge of healing plants useless when there are no plants to be found, no ailments to treat beyond the universal condition of slow starvation that affects them all. She has delivered most of the children in Grimwald, has tended the sick and injured through countless crises. But against hunger she has no remedy, no potion or prayer that can create nourishment where none exists. The church stands empty now, its priests fled with the first wave of refugees. Father Bernard, who once preached of divine providence, and the rewards that await the faithful in heaven, packed his few possessions and departed without ceremony when it became clear that Providence had abandoned this particular corner of creation. The altar where he celebrated Mass stands bare, its candles long since consumed for light and warmth rather than worship. This abandonment cuts deeper than physical deprivation. These are people whose entire understanding of existence rests upon the foundation of divine order, who have been taught that suffering has meaning, that endurance brings reward, that faith provides comfort in the darkest hours. But faith requires some evidence of divine presence, some sign that the universe contains purpose and justice. When children starve while the powerful feast, when virtue brings only punishment and evil prospers, the very foundations of belief begin to crumble. Margot sits by the small wrapped bundle that was her youngest child, her lips moving in prayers that no longer carry conviction. The words are familiar, worn smooth by repetition like stones in a river, but they fall into silence that offers no echo of divine response. She prays because it is the only action left to her, but the prayers feel hollow, ritual performed by habit rather than hope. The physical symptoms of advanced malnutrition manifest themselves with clinical precision. Margot's hair, once thick and lustrous, comes out in handfuls when she runs her fingers through it. Her gums bleed when she bites down on the scraps of bark and root that constitute their diet. Her teeth loosen sockets that seem to widen daily. Her skin takes on the translucent quality of parchment, revealing the blue tracery of veins beneath. More disturbing are the mental effects. Her thoughts move with the sluggish quality of honey in winter, simple concepts requiring enormous effort to grasp and hold. Names become elusive, faces blur together, memories slip away like smoke. The sharp intelligence that once helped her manage the complex logistics of peasant survival now struggles with basic arithmetic, loses track of time's passage, forgets the names of her own children. This cognitive decline represents perhaps hunger's cruelest aspect, that it strips away not just physical capability but the very identity that makes each person unique. Margot feels herself becoming less with each passing day, her personality dissolving as surely as her body consumes itself. She is losing not just her life but herself, becoming a hollow vessel that once contained a human being. Aldrich fares little better. His hands, those instruments of survival that have wielded every tool of peasant labor, now shake too violently to perform even simple tasks. When he tries to whittle kindling, the knife slips from his grasp. When he attempts to mend tears in their clothing, his fingers cannot manage the delicate work of threading a needle. The skills that defined him, that gave his life meaning and purpose, slip away like water through a broken cup. The children respond to their hunger in ways that break their parents' hearts. They have stopped asking for food, recognizing with the terrible wisdom of the young that no food exists to be given. Instead, they sleep most of the day, conserving energy that they do not possess, dreaming perhaps of better times or better worlds. When they wake, it is with the confused disorientation of those whose minds no longer track the normal rhythms of day and night. Young Tam, once the family's hope for advancement beyond the grinding poverty of peasant life, can no longer focus his attention long enough to recite the simple prayers his mother taught him. His quick mind, their greatest treasure in a world that offered few opportunities for those born into his station, moves now with the halting uncertainty of age. At 10 years old, he shuffles like an elderly man, his body already beginning the process of shutting down non-essential functions to preserve what remains of life. The silence in their hovel has taken on weight and texture, pressing down upon them like a physical presence. They speak rarely now, partly to conserve energy but mainly because there is nothing left to say that has not been said, nothing left to plan that can actually be planned. Their conversations, when they occur at all, consist of brief exchanges of practical information, whether the fire needs tending, whether anyone has spotted edible scraps in the village ruins, whether the pain in this or that part of their bodies has worsened since yesterday. But beneath the surface of this enforced calm, darker currents flow. Aldrich finds himself looking at his wife and children with calculations that horrify him even as they force themselves into his consciousness. The arithmetic of survival has reduced his family to variables in an equation that has no acceptable solution. 3 children remain alive. How long can they survive on no food at all? If one were to die, would the others last longer? If two were to die? These thoughts come unbidden, unwelcome, but persistent as infection. They represent the final breakdown of the moral framework that has governed his life, the reduction of love itself to mere calculation. He recognizes their evil even as he finds himself unable to banish them, knows that he is becoming something he once would have despised even as necessity pushes him toward transformations he lacks the strength to resist. Margot struggles with her own demons, her own versions of the impossible arithmetic that governs their situation. The baby's death, which should have freed resources for the surviving children, has instead deepened their despair to levels that make survival itself questionable. She finds herself wishing sometimes that the end would come quickly, that they could all simply sleep and not wake, that the struggle could conclude without requiring any more choices from those who have already made too many. But even these dark wishes are luxuries their situation does not permit. Death by starvation is slow, allowing ample time for the contemplation of every stage of dissolution. They will remain conscious almost to the end, watching their bodies fail them piece by piece, feeling their minds grow dim as malnutrition takes its toll on the complex chemistry of thought and memory. The nights have become particularly difficult. Sleep, once a refuge from the hardships of their waking hours, now brings dreams that mock their condition. They dream of feasts, of tables laden with bread and meat and milk, of the simple satisfaction of full bellies and contented rest. They wake to find their mouths wet with saliva triggered by these phantom meals, their stomachs clenching with renewed awareness of their emptiness. Worse are the dreams of their dead baby, visions in which the child lives and thrives, grows fat and happy in worlds where love is sufficient protection against the harsh realities of medieval existence. Margot wakes from these dreams to find herself reaching for a child who is not there, calling out names that echo in empty air, experiencing again and again the fresh shock of loss that time does nothing to diminish. The boundary between sleeping and waking begins to blur as malnutrition affects their brain chemistry. They slip into states that are either fully conscious nor completely asleep, twilight conditions in which hallucinations seem as real as memory, in which the past and present merge into confused narratives that make less sense with each telling. In these altered states, they sometimes see visitors, relatives long dead, children who never lived to adulthood, friends who departed years ago for distant lands. These phantom figures seem to offer comfort and counsel, but their words dissolve like morning mists when examined too closely, leaving behind only the bitter taste of false hope. The physical world around them begins to seem less real than these visions. The walls of their hovel fade to gray transparency through which other times and places show dimly. The fire in their hearths sometimes appears to them as sunlight streaming through windows that do not exist, warming faces that are not there. Reality becomes negotiable, subject to revision by minds that no longer possess the energy to maintain clear distinctions between what is and what is wished for. This dissolution of the boundaries between real and imagined represents the final stage before complete breakdown. Their bodies, having exhausted every resource, begin to shut down systems that require too much energy to maintain. Vision blurs, hearing becomes intermittent, the sense of touch grows distant and unreliable. They are becoming ghosts even before death claims them, fading from the world by degrees. But even in this extremity, love persists. Margot still reaches out to touch her children's faces, still whispers words of comfort that she no longer has breath to speak clearly. Aldrich still tries to shield his family from the worst of the cold, still positions his failing body between them and the door when night sounds suggest danger. The instincts of protection and care continue to function even when all other human capacities have failed. This persistence of love in the face of absolute dissolution might be seen as triumph or tragedy, depending upon one's perspective. It represents the final irreducible core of human nature, the element that survives even when everything else has been stripped away by circumstance. But it also makes their suffering more acute, transforms their dying into a prolonged goodbye to everything that has given their lives meaning. The snow begins to fall as evening approaches, fat flakes that drift through the hole in their roof to land on skin too numb to feel their touch. Winter is tightening its grip on the land, promising months more of the cold that makes their hunger even more deadly. Their fire dwindles to embers that provide no warmth, and they lack the strength to venture out in search of fuel to feed it. They huddle together in the darkness, sharing what little body heat their diminished forms can generate. The sound of their breathing grows shallower, more irregular, punctuated by pauses that stretch longer with each passing hour. Outside, the wind rises to a howl that seems to echo the sound of their own approaching dissolution. But they are still alive, still conscious, still capable of thought and feeling and the recognition of their own suffering. The end approaches with agonizing slowness, promising no relief from awareness until the final moment when consciousness itself gutters out like a candle in an exhausted flame. This is the medieval peasant's death, not swift and merciful but extended and observed, not heroic or meaningful but simply the logical conclusion of mathematics that never balanced, of calculations that never added up to survival. They die as they lived, in poverty and pain and the terrible clarity that comes from seeing the world exactly as it is rather than as it should be. The snow continues to fall, covering their hovel with a blanket of white that makes it indistinguishable from the other ruins scattered throughout what was once the village of Grimwald. Soon, there will be no evidence that they ever existed, no marker to indicate that here lived people who loved and hoped and struggled against odds too great to overcome. But not yet. For now, in the gathering darkness, they still breathe, still suffer, still love each other with whatever capacity for love remains in bodies that have been reduced to their most essential elements. The final chapter of their story has not yet been written, though its ending grows more certain with each labored breath, each flutter of failing heartbeats, each moment that passes without miracle or mercy to alter the trajectory toward dissolution. The night deepens, and with it their journey toward whatever lies beyond the mathematics of medieval survival. The equation that has governed their lives approaches its final solution, and the answer it provides speaks truths about the human condition that no philosophy or theology has ever been able to explain away. Dawn breaks gray as old bone over a landscape transformed by snow that has fallen steadily through the night. The village of Grimwald lies buried beneath a blanket of white that makes it appear almost peaceful, almost clean, hiding beneath its pristine surface the accumulated filth and devastation of lives ground down to their essential elements. Inside the hovel that has become their tomb, the family huddles in a silence so complete it seems to have weight and substance. The fire died hours ago, its last embers cooling to ash that provides no warmth beyond the fading memory of heat. Their breath mists an air so cold it burns their throats. But even this discomfort seems distant now, filtered through the fog of malnutrition that has settled over their minds like a merciful veil. Aldrich lies on his side, one arm draped protectively over Marta, who has not spoken for 2 days. Her breathing comes in shallow sips that barely disturb the air, each exhalation a visible puff of vapor that dissipates quickly in the frigid atmosphere. Her face has taken on the waxy pallor that marks the approach of death, her skin stretched so tight over her skull that the bones beneath seem ready to break through. Young Tam sits propped against the wall, his eyes open but unfocused, staring at something only he can see. His lips move occasionally, forming words that make no sound, conducting conversations with visitors who exist only in the chemistry of his starving brain. Sometimes he smiles at these phantom encounters, his face lighting with a joy so pure it breaks the heart to witness. Little Bess has not moved for hours, her small body curled in the fetal position that seems to offer some unconscious comfort against the approach of dissolution. Her skin has taken on a bluish tinge that speaks of circulation failing, of a heart that no longer has the strength to pump blood to her extremities. She might already be gone. In this twilight state between life and death, the distinction becomes academic. Margot holds the wrapped bundle that was her youngest child, though whether from maternal instinct or confusion is no longer clear. The line between her living children and her dead one has blurred in her mind, all of them equally precious, equally lost, equally beyond her power to protect. She rocks the small form with movements that have become purely mechanical, muscle memory divorced from conscious intention. The silence is broken only by the sound of wind through gaps in the walls, a low moaning that might be mistaken for human voices if one were inclined towards such interpretations. The hovel itself seems to be dying along with its inhabitants, its walls sagging inward under the weight of accumulated snow, its roof threatening to collapse at any moment under burdens it was never designed to bear. But death by starvation is not a swift release. It is a process of gradual shutdown, system by system, function by function, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind that grows stronger with each passing moment. They remain aware of their condition, aware of each other's suffering, aware of the approaching end even as they lack the strength to influence its arrival. The body's final reserves are being consumed now, proteins from muscles, fats from organs, even the myelin sheaths that insulate nerve fibers. This last represents the beginning of neurological breakdown, the point at which the brain itself begins to be digested to fuel the desperate chemistry of survival. Thoughts become fragmentary, memories dissolve, the very sense of self starts to dissipate like smoke in wind. Aldrich feels his mind slipping away from him like water through cupped hands. Faces blur together in his memory. His wife's features merge with those of his mother, dead these 20 years. His children's voices echo with the sounds of his own childhood, distant and strange. The accumulated experiences of 35 years of life collapse into a confused jumble of sensations that no longer connect to form coherent narrative. But through this dissolution, certain images remain with crystalline clarity. The first time he saw Margot at the village fair, her hair catching sunlight like spun gold, her laughter cutting through the noise of merchants and musicians to reach his heart directly. The night they were married, dancing by torchlight, while the whole village celebrated their union. The morning each of their children was born, those moments of pure joy when new life seemed to promise infinite possibility. These memories are precious now precisely because they exist outside the mathematics of scarcity, beyond the reach of calculation and compromise. They represent moments when love was simple, when hope required no justification, when the future stretched ahead like an unplowed field ready for seeding. They are islands of meaning in an ocean of dissolution, proof that their lives contained more than mere survival even if survival ultimately eluded them. The snow continues to fall, each flake adding to the accumulation that threatens to bury their hovel entirely. Soon, the roof will collapse under the weight, bringing tons of timber and thatch crashing down to entomb them where they lie. It would be a mercy of sorts, burial without ceremony, an ending that requires no strength or decision on their part, dissolution into the earth that has sustained and betrayed them in equal measure. Outside, the village completes its transformation into a monument to failure. The houses that once sheltered families stand empty, their doors gaping like mouths frozen in permanent screams. The church steeple, still visible above the snow, points toward a heaven that has offered no intervention, no miracle to alter the trajectory of events that has brought them to this ending. Other villages throughout the region face similar fates. The systematic destruction wrought by armies on the move has created a zone of desolation that stretches for hundreds of miles, communities reduced to ash and memory, populations scattered or dead. This is the true face of medieval warfare, not the glorious conflicts celebrated in song and story, but the grinding destruction of the foundation upon which civilization itself rests. The great lords who initiated these conflicts remain insulated from their consequences, protected by wealth and power from the realities they have unleashed. They feast in their castles while peasants starve in their hovels, plan new campaigns while the results of previous ones rot in unmarked graves, speak of honor and glory while children die in their mother's arms. But in the hovel where the family lies dying, such larger perspectives become irrelevant. Their world has contracted to the space between four walls, their concerns reduced to the simple question of whether this breath will be followed by another, whether consciousness will persist for another moment, or finally surrender to the darkness that presses in from all sides. Tam's breathing becomes irregular, long pauses between inhalations that stretch toward silence. His eyes, when they focus at all, see things that exist only in the private theater of his failing mind. Sometimes he reaches out to touch faces that are not there, speaks names that echo in empty air, participates in conversations that exist only in the misfiring neurons of his starving brain. His parents watch with the helpless love of those who have exhausted every resource, tried every strategy, made every sacrifice that their circumstances permitted. They have given everything they possessed, their food, their warmth, their strength, their hope, and it has not been enough. Love itself, that force they believed could overcome any obstacle, has proven inadequate against the simple mathematics of scarcity. This represents perhaps the deepest tragedy of their situation. Not that they die, for death comes to all, but that they die knowing their love was insufficient, that their best efforts fell short of preserving what they treasured most. They faced the end with the bitter knowledge that caring deeply provided no protection against casual destruction, that devotion offered no shield against indifferent forces too large to influence or escape. Young Marta stirs slightly, her eyes opening to fix on her mother's face with an expression of profound recognition. For a moment, the fog of malnutrition clears, and she is fully present, fully aware of where she is and what is happening to her. Her hand, thin as a bird's claw, reaches out to touch Margot's cheek with infinite gentleness. "Mama," she whispers, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of everything unsaid, everything that cannot be expressed in the language of the dying. It is goodbye and forgiveness and love distilled to its purest essence, stripped of everything extraneous to become simply the recognition of bond that transcends even death. Margot's response comes from depths she did not know she still possessed, reserves of strength that maternal love somehow conjures even when the body has nothing left to give. She gathers her daughter closer, finding in physical contact a comfort that words cannot provide, a communion that exists beyond the reach of language or thought. "I know, little one," she manages, her voice rough with tears that she lacks the moisture to shed. "I know. It's all right. You can rest now." The permission seems to release something in the child, some final tension that has kept her anchored to consciousness against her body's desperate need to let go. Her breathing grows shallow, then shallower still, until it becomes almost indistinguishable from the whisper of wind through broken walls. Her hand slips from her mother's cheek to lie still against the straw, and the essential spark that made her uniquely herself gutters out like a candle flame in windless air. The silence that follows is different from the silences that have come before. This one has finality to it, the weight of conclusion rather than pause. One light has gone out in their small constellation, and the remaining stars seem dimmer for its absence, their own flames flickering more uncertainly in the darkness that surrounds them all. Aldrich reaches across the space between them to touch his wife's shoulder, a gesture that communicates everything that needs saying between them. They have lost another child, but they have also witnessed something that transcends loss. The grace with which innocence faces dissolution, the dignity that can exist even in circumstances that seem to strip away all possibility of dignity. Little Bess follows her sister into whatever lies beyond consciousness without drama or distress. Her breathing simply becomes lighter and lighter until it merges with the ambient sounds of wind and settling wood, until the boundary between her exhalations and the air around them disappears entirely. She dies as she lived, quietly, without complaint, accepting what cannot be changed with the stoicism that has become the defining characteristic of her brief existence. Now only 3 remain, and the mathematics of their situation become even more stark. 3 bodies generating heat in a space designed for many more, 3 sets of lungs sharing air that grows thinner with each breath, 3 minds connected by love that makes their individual suffering collective, exponential, unbearable in its intensity. But love also provides comfort in the face of this final dissolution. They are not dying alone, not facing the darkness as isolated individuals but as part of something larger than themselves. Their family unit, reduced now to its core elements, maintains its essential character even as death claims them one by one. They remain connected by bonds that physical dissolution cannot sever. Tam's departure comes with a gentleness that surprises his parents, who had expected his fighter's spirit to rage against the approaching darkness. Instead, he simply closes his eyes and fails to open them again, his breathing growing so faint that the moment of transition passes almost unnoticed. One instant he is with them, the next he has joined his sisters in whatever realm awaits beyond the reach of hunger, and cold, and pain. The snow continues to fall, and the roof creaks ominously under its growing weight. Soon, the inevitable collapse will come, bringing down the structure that has sheltered them through these final hours. But that ending lies in the future, perhaps minutes away, perhaps hours. For now, they are still here, still conscious, still capable of this final communion between 2 people who have shared everything that life could offer, joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and loss. Aldrich and Margot lie facing each other across the small space that contains all that remains of their world. Their breathing synchronizes in the unconscious way of those who have shared years of intimate proximity, their hearts beating in rhythm established by decades of sleeping side by side, waking together, facing each day's challenges as a unit rather than as individuals. They do not speak. Words have become unnecessary between them, communication reduced to its most essential elements. The touch of skin against skin, the shared warmth of breath, the recognition that passes between eyes that have seen each other in every conceivable circumstance and found love sufficient to encompass them all. This is intimacy of a kind that only extremity can create, connection forged in the crucible of shared suffering and refined to absolute purity. They are dying, but they are dying together, and in that togetherness they find something that transcends the horror of their situation, something that makes meaning from meaninglessness, hope from hopelessness, victory from what appears to be absolute defeat. The baby's wrapped form lies between them like a bridge connecting past to present, love to loss, the children they were blessed to have to the children they could not save. Margot's hand rests upon the small bundle, and Aldrich covers her fingers with his own, completing a circle that encompasses all of their love, all of their grief, all of their acceptance of what cannot be changed. Outside, the wind rises to a howl that shakes the walls and sets the roof timbers groaning with strain. This sound might be interpreted as mourning, as the earth itself grieving for lives cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Or it might simply be weather, the impersonal forces of nature indifferent to human suffering, unconcerned with individual tragedy in the face of larger systems that operate according to their own logic. But inside the hovel, interpretation becomes irrelevant. What matters is the warmth they still generate together, the consciousness they still share, the love that persists even as everything else fails them. They have lost everything except each other, and in each other they have found something that no external force can take away. The knowledge that their lives contain meaning, that their love was real, that they faced the impossible with courage and dignity and grace. The roof gives way with a sound like thunder, bringing down beams and thatch and accumulated snow in an avalanche of destruction that would crush anyone still capable of being crushed. But by then, the hovel is already empty of everything that truly mattered. The building dies along with its inhabitants, returning to the earth that supplied its materials, becoming part of the landscape it once interrupted. Spring will come eventually, melting the snow that covers their grave, bringing green shoots up through soil enriched by their dissolution. New life will grow from the nutrients their bodies provide, continuing cycles that preceded them and will continue long after even their memory has faded. In this sense, they achieve a kind of immortality, their substance returning to the great circulation of matter and energy that sustains all life. But that is cold comfort to offer to those who die in winter darkness, who never see another spring, who must find meaning in their ending rather than in any continuation beyond it. Their story concludes not with resurrection or redemption but with simple acceptance of limits that no human will can transcend, mathematics that no love can overcome, circumstances that reduce even the most devoted family to bones beneath snow. This is the medieval peasant's death, not heroic or meaningful but simply final, the logical conclusion of lives lived always on the edge of impossibility. They die as they lived, in poverty and anonymity, their passing unmarked by any monument except the brief disturbance their bodies make in earth that has absorbed countless others like them throughout the long centuries of human suffering. The wind continues to blow across the ruins of what was once Grimwald, carrying away the last traces of human habitation, erasing the evidence that here lived people who loved and hoped and struggled against circumstances too great to overcome. Soon, there will be nothing left to indicate that they ever existed, nothing to suggest that in this place families faced impossible choices with courage and dignity and grace. But for now, in this moment before even memory fails, their story persists, a testament to the capacity for love to endure even when everything else fails, to the human ability to find meaning in suffering, to the simple fact that they were here, that they mattered, that their lives and deaths are worthy of remembrance even if no one remains to remember them. The snow falls, covering all traces, writing the final word in a story that began with hope and ended with acceptance of what hope could not achieve. The chapter closes, but the greater story continues, the endless tale of human endurance in the face of impossible odds, of love that persists despite circumstances that seem designed to crush it, of meaning found in lives that appear to lack all meaning. This is what remains when everything else has been taken away, the knowledge that they faced the darkness together, that love proved stronger than death even when death proved stronger than life, that in their ending they achieved something that no external force could destroy or diminish. The wind carries their story away, but stories have a way of returning, of finding new voices to speak them, new hearts to hold them, new understanding to give them meaning. Their lives were brief and difficult and ended badly, but they were also filled with love and courage and the quiet heroism of endurance. In that heroism, perhaps, lies whatever immortality peasants can claim, not in monuments or songs but in the simple fact that they lived and loved and died with dignity intact, that no external force could strip away their essential humanity, that in the end they remained themselves despite everything that conspired to reduce them to less. The snow continues to fall, but beneath it, something persists. The memory of lives lived fully despite limitation, love expressed completely despite scarcity, hope maintained stubbornly despite overwhelming evidence of its futility. These are treasures that no army can loot, no famine can consume, no winter can freeze. The story ends, but its meaning lingers, waiting to be discovered by those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand what love can accomplish even in circumstances where it cannot accomplish everything. This is the final gift of the medieval peasant, not victory over suffering but demonstration that suffering need not mean defeat, that love can transform even the most tragic ending into something that transcends tragedy. The wind dies away, leaving perfect silence over a landscape wiped clean by snow. But in that silence, somehow, love echoes still. Years pass like pages turned by an invisible hand, each season writing its changes across the landscape where Grimwald once stood. The snow melts to reveal foundations crumbling back to earth, walls subsiding into the soil that gave them form, the systematic erasure of human habitation by forces that recognize no distinction between the works of man and the fallen logs they so closely resemble. Nature reclaims the abandoned village with the patient persistence of grass growing through stone. Vines wind through broken doorframes, weeds sprout from collapsed roofs, trees take root in spaces where hearths once burned with the warm light of human habitation. Within a decade, only the most careful observer would recognize that humans ever lived here at all. But the story of Grimwald represents more than the tale of one family, one village, one moment of crisis in the vast sweep of medieval history. It stands as testament to a system of existence so brutal, so indifferent to human suffering, that survival itself became an act of heroism performed daily by millions who received no recognition for their courage. The feudal structure that governed medieval life was built upon the systematic exploitation of those least able to resist it. Peasants, bound to their land by laws that made their bondage absolute, existed to provide the surplus that supported a pyramid of privilege reaching up through knights and lords to kings who claimed divine right to rule over subjects they regarded as little more than livestock with the inconvenient capacity for speech. This was not mere inequality, but something approaching a different species of human existence. While nobles feasted on delicacies imported from distant lands, peasants survived on bread so coarse it was barely distinguishable from cattle feed. While aristocrats lived in chambers warmed by massive fireplaces and furnished with tapestries and cushions, common people huddled in hovels that provided barely more shelter than caves. While the wealthy enjoyed the ministrations of physicians trained in the universities of Paris and Bologna, the poor died of ailments that proper nutrition might have prevented and basic medical knowledge could have cured. The taxation system that supported this hierarchy operated with the ruthless efficiency of a machine designed to extract maximum value from human misery. Peasants owed not only a portion of their harvests but days of free labor, fees for the use of mills and ovens they could not afford to build themselves, tribute for the protection of lords who were often the greatest threat to their safety. These obligations were not negotiable. They could not be reduced in years when the harvest failed, could not be postponed when sickness prevented labor, could not be forgiven when children died and parents mourned. The system required its feeding regardless of the cost to those who provided it, and that cost was measured not in coins but in lives cut short, families destroyed, communities reduced to scattered bones bleaching under an indifferent sun. Disease moved through medieval populations like fire through dry grass, finding in malnourished bodies the perfect conditions for epidemic spread. The Black Death, which would later claim a third of Europe's population, was only the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeated itself with terrible regularity. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, influenza, each outbreak found its most fertile ground among the poor, whose weakened immune systems could not mount effective defense against pathogens that well-fed bodies might resist. But even without epidemic disease, the baseline mortality among peasants reached levels that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Of those who survived childhood, many succumbed to the diseases of malnutrition before reaching reproductive age. Those who lived long enough to bear children faced maternal mortality rates that made pregnancy a form of Russian roulette. The women who survived childbirth often found themselves trapped in cycles of reproduction and loss that ground them down as surely as millstones grind grain. Pregnant or nursing almost continuously throughout their fertile years, their bodies never fully recovering from the demands of one pregnancy before being required to sustain another, they aged rapidly and died young, worn out by the biological imperative to replace the children that death claimed with such ruthless regularity. Agricultural technology remained primitive not from ignorance but from the systematic denial of resources that might have funded improvement. The three-field system that governed crop rotation was marginally better than allowing land to lie fallow, but it still left a third of arable land unproductive in any given year. Plowing was accomplished with wooden implements that scratched rather than turned the soil, limiting the depth at which crops could be planted and reducing yields that were already marginal. The weather itself seemed allied with forces arrayed against peasant survival. The medieval warm period had ended, giving way to centuries of cooling climate that shortened growing seasons and made harvests increasingly unreliable. Successive crop failures became common, creating famines that swept across Europe with the regularity of tides, each one carrying away populations already weakened by chronic malnutrition. But beyond these physical hardships lay psychological torments that may have been even more devastating. Medieval peasants lived with the constant awareness of their own expendability, the knowledge that they existed solely to serve purposes defined by others, that their lives had value only insofar as they contributed to systems that offered them no benefit. They were born into circumstances they could not change, lived according to rules they had no voice in making, died to serve causes they could not understand. The Church, which might have provided comfort and meaning in the face of such circumstances, instead preached a doctrine that made their suffering a virtue and their poverty a blessing. They were told that their hardships in this life would be rewarded in the next, that acceptance of injustice demonstrated spiritual strength, that rebellion against their ordained station constituted sin against divine order. This theological framework transformed their exploitation into a moral imperative, making resistance not just futile but actively evil. They were required not only to endure their circumstances but to embrace them as expressions of God's will, to find in their degradation evidence of divine love, to thank their oppressors for providing opportunities to demonstrate Christian virtue through patient suffering. The psychological damage inflicted by such teaching cannot be calculated in any ledger that deals in material quantities. It represents the systematic destruction of human agency, the reduction of complex individuals to mere instruments of others' purposes, the transformation of natural human desires for dignity and self-determination into sources of guilt and spiritual contamination. Yet somehow, despite everything arrayed against them, medieval peasants maintained their humanity. Love persisted in circumstances designed to crush it. Families formed bonds that death itself could not entirely sever. Communities developed networks of mutual support that functioned despite legal systems designed to prevent cooperation among the exploited. Children played in the brief moments when labor and survival permitted, creating games from scraps and imagination, finding joy in small victories and temporary respites from hardship. Parents told stories that preserved memory and meaning across generations that had little reason to believe in continuity. Artists emerged from the most unlikely circumstances to create beauty that transcended the ugliness of their daily existence. This represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval peasant life, not the suffering they endured but the humanity they preserved despite systematic attempts to reduce them to something less than human. They maintained their capacity for love in circumstances that provided little encouragement for loving, held on to hope when hope seemed foolish, created meaning from lives that appeared to lack all meaning. The village of Grimwald vanishes beneath encroaching forest, its foundations returning to earth, its memories preserved only in soil enriched by the bodies of those who called it home. But its story continues in countless other villages facing similar challenges, countless other families making impossible choices with courage and grace, countless other individuals discovering that love can survive even when those who love cannot. This persistence of human value in the face of systematic devaluation represents the true miracle of medieval peasant existence. They were not heroic in any conventional sense, did not win victories or achieve fame, or leave monuments to mark their passing. But they were heroic in a deeper way, in their refusal to surrender their humanity despite circumstances that made humanity seem like an unaffordable luxury. Their lives were brief and difficult and ended badly, but they were also filled with love and courage and the quiet heroism of endurance. They faced impossible odds with dignity intact, met suffering with acceptance that transformed suffering itself into something approaching transcendence, found in their very powerlessness a kind of power that no external force could diminish or destroy. The feudal system that crushed them has long since passed into history, replaced by other forms of organization that create their own hierarchies and inequalities. But the human capacity for love and endurance that they demonstrated persists, manifesting itself in new contexts but retaining the essential characteristics that made their lives meaningful despite circumstances that seemed designed to strip all meaning away. In remembering them, we honor not just their suffering but their response to suffering, the grace with which they faced dissolution, the love they maintained despite every reason to abandon it, the dignity they preserved even when preservation itself seemed impossible. They were ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things simply by remaining human in circumstances that made humanity itself an act of rebellion. The snow melts, the seasons turn, the earth continues its ancient rotation around a sun that shines equally on peasant and prince, giving light freely to all without regard for station or wealth, or the ability to pay for illumination. In this impartiality of natural forces, perhaps, lies whatever justice medieval peasants could claim, that they shared equally in the fundamental experiences that define human existence, that their capacity for love and suffering and meaning was no less than that of those who ruled them. Their story ends where it began, in recognition of love's power to transcend circumstances, to create meaning from meaninglessness, to transform even the most tragic circumstances into testimony to human worth and dignity. They died as they lived, together, loving, undefeated by forces that could destroy their bodies but not their essential selves. In the silence that follows their passing, something endures. The memory of lives lived fully despite limitation, love expressed completely despite scarcity, hope maintained stubbornly despite overwhelming evidence of its futility. These are treasures that no army can loot, no famine can consume, no winter can freeze. Their voices join the chorus of countless others who faced similar fates throughout the long darkness of medieval history, peasants and serfs and bondsmen who lived and loved and died in obscurity but whose lives contained the same capacity for meaning and transcendence that marks all human existence at its finest. They speak across the centuries to remind us that dignity is not dependent upon circumstances, that love needs no external validation to be real, that the human spirit can find ways to soar even when the body is chained to earth. The story of Grimwald becomes part of the larger story of human endurance, joining its voice to the eternal song that celebrates not victory over suffering but the transformation of suffering into something that transcends itself. In remembering them, we acknowledge our own capacity for such transformation, our own potential for finding meaning in circumstances that seem to offer none. They are gone, but they are not lost. They live in the soil that nurtured new growth, in the memory of those who understand what they endured, in the recognition that love can create light even in the deepest darkness. Their story ends, but the truth it tells continues, that humanity persists, that love endures, that meaning can be found even in the most tragic circumstances if we have the courage to look for it, and the wisdom to recognize it when we find it. The sun sets over the empty field where Grimwald once stood, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have brought joy to eyes that no longer exist to see them. But beauty continues without witnesses, love persists without objects, meaning endures without minds to comprehend it. In this persistence lies whatever immortality peasants can claim, not individual survival but participation in patterns larger than any individual life. The darkness that follows is complete, but it is not final. Morning will come again, bringing light to illuminate new struggles and new forms of courage, new families facing impossible odds with love as their only weapon. The story continues, has always continued, will always continue as long as human beings draw breath and choose to love despite every reason not to. This is the final lesson of medieval peasant life. Not that suffering is meaningless, but that meaning can be found even in the deepest suffering if we have the courage to look for it. They found it, held it, died with it intact. In that achievement lies their true victory, their actual immortality, their lasting gift to all who come after them, seeking examples of what human love can accomplish even when it cannot accomplish everything. The story ends where all human stories end, in silence, in darkness, in the return to earth from which all life springs. But between the beginning and the ending lies everything that matters, the love shared, the courage shown, the dignity maintained despite circumstances designed to strip dignity away. In that space between birth and death, they created something beautiful and true and lasting, something that no external force could diminish or destroy. Their names are forgotten, their faces lost to time, their voices silenced by centuries. But what they represented, the human capacity for love in the face of hopelessness, for courage despite impossible odds, for meaning despite circumstances that seem to offer none, that persists, echoes, calls across the darkness to remind us what we are capable of when we choose to be fully human. The field where Grimwald stood lies empty under stars that shone equally on their struggles and on ours, connecting their story to all stories, their love to all love, their courage to the courage that exists in every human heart waiting to be awakened by necessity or choice. They are gone, but they are also eternal, part of the great human story that includes all of us, claims all of us, makes all of us heirs to their legacy of love triumphant over circumstances that seem designed to make love impossible. In remembering them, we remember ourselves. In honoring their courage, we acknowledge our own potential for heroism. In grieving their losses, we affirm the value of what they preserved despite everything arrayed against preservation. They died, but they also lived, and in their living they achieved something that death cannot touch. The knowledge that love is stronger than circumstance, that meaning transcends suffering, that human dignity cannot be destroyed by any external force no matter how overwhelming it appears. This is their gift to us across the centuries, the example of what it means to be fully human in circumstances that seem designed to make humanity impossible. They faced the darkness and found light within themselves, faced despair and discovered hope in places where hope should not exist, faced death and achieved through their dying a kind of victory that no external force could grant or take away. The story ends, but its meaning continues, calling to us across the silence to remember what they achieved, to honor what they preserved, to carry forward the light they kept burning even when everything else went dark. In that calling lies whatever immortality any of us can claim, not individual survival but participation in something larger than ourselves. Something that includes all human love and courage and dignity across all time. They rest now beneath soil that has absorbed their substance and transformed it into new life, their story complete but their meaning enduring, their voices silenced but their truth echoing still in the hearts of all who understand what love can accomplish when it refuses to surrender to circumstances that seem to make surrender the only reasonable choice. The field lies empty, but it is also full of memory, full of meaning, full of the persistent human capacity to create light in darkness, to find hope in hopelessness, to transform even the most tragic circumstances into testimony to the indestructible power of love. This is their legacy, their gift, their victory over forces that could destroy their bodies but never touch their souls. In the end, they achieved what no external power could grant them, the knowledge that their lives mattered, that their love was real, that their courage made a difference even when it could not change the outcome. They died as they lived, together, loving, undefeated by anything that truly mattered. The stars shine down on empty fields, but they also shine on full hearts, hearts that remember, that honor, that carry forward the light these forgotten peasants kept burning through the darkest night. Their story ends, but their truth continues, and in that continuation lies whatever immortality love can claim against the forces that would reduce it to nothing. They are gone, but they are also here, in every act of love performed despite impossible circumstances, in every choice to preserve dignity when dignity seems pointless, in every decision to hope when hope appears futile. They live in all who remember that humanity is not dependent upon circumstances, but upon choices made in the face of circumstances, choices to love and care and protect what matters most regardless of the cost. This is the final word in their story, not defeat but triumph, not meaninglessness but meaning deeper than philosophy, not ending but transformation into something that time cannot touch and death cannot diminish. They face the impossible with love as their only weapon, and in the end, love proves sufficient not to change their circumstances but to transcend them entirely. The wind rises again, carrying across empty fields the echo of their courage, the memory of their love, the persistent human truth that some things matter more than survival, that dignity can exist even in degradation, that meaning can be found even in circumstances that seem to offer none. Their story is finished, but it is also eternal, part of the great human narrative that includes all suffering transformed by love, all courage demonstrated in the face of impossible odds, all dignity preserved despite systematic attempts at its destruction. They join their voices to that eternal chorus, adding their testimony to the evidence that humanity persists, that love endures, that meaning can be found even in the darkest circumstances if we have the courage to seek it and the wisdom to recognize it when we find it. The darkness is complete, but it is not final. Somewhere, in fields and villages yet to be born, other families will face similar challenges with similar courage. Other love stories will unfold in circumstances that seem designed to make love impossible. The pattern continues, has always continued, will always continue as long as human beings choose to love despite every reason not to. In that choice lies whatever victory any of us can claim against forces that seem designed to crush us, not the victory of changing circumstances, but the victory of remaining human despite circumstances, of preserving what matters most even when preservation seems impossible, of creating light in darkness through the simple act of refusing to let darkness have the final word. The story of medieval peasant life is finished, but its meaning echoes still in every heart that understands what love can accomplish when it refuses to surrender, what courage can achieve when it chooses to persist, what dignity can preserve even when everything else is lost. They died, but they also lived, and in their living they demonstrated truths that no external force can diminish or destroy. This is their legacy, the knowledge that love is stronger than circumstance, that meaning transcends suffering, that human dignity is indestructible when it chooses to be. They carried that knowledge with them into whatever lies beyond this life, and they leave it behind for all who have the wisdom to recognize its value and the courage to claim it as their own. The field lies empty under stars that witness their struggle and their triumph, their defeat and their victory, their ending and their beginning in the eternal story of human love refusing to surrender to forces that would reduce it to nothing. In that refusal lies whatever immortality any of us can claim, whatever victory any of us can achieve, whatever meaning any of us can find in lives that appear to offer little meaning at all. They are gone, but they are also here, in every act of love, every choice for courage, every decision to preserve dignity when dignity seems pointless. The fields fall silent. The fires burn low. For medieval peasants, life was not a story of prosperity, but of endurance. Their suffering built the foundations of kingdoms, yet their names were forgotten. Survival was never certain, and for many, it was never possible. If this glimpse into history's shadows struck you, leave a like to keep the fire alive, and share your thoughts below. Could you have survived as a peasant in the Middle Ages? Subscribe to Nighttime Historian, and walk with me into the next dark chapter of history.